The silence from Haven was the first sign. For 3 generations, humanity had watched the Ark Odyssey slide through the silent, velvet dark, a silver needle stitching a thread of hope between star systems. On board were 100,000 souls asleep in crystalline pods, the distilled essence of a species that had nearly choked on its own cradle world. They were farmers and physicists, poets and engineers, children who had never seen Earth's sun, all dreaming of a new dawn on a planet they would make their own. The Odyssey was more than a ship. It was a promise, a penance, and the full genetic and cultural archive of a humanity that had finally learned to look beyond its own bloody history. From the Lunar Mission Control Center, Dr. Alara Vance had watched its progress for 15 years, her life measured in the slow, steady pulse of the Ark's telemetry. Her husband, Captain Ivan Vance, was its commander. His last message a grainy, time-delayed video filled with love and the quiet confidence of a man on the cusp of making history. She was watching the final approach telemetry, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, when the signal vanished. It didn't fade or crackle. It was simply erased, a single, clean cut in the fabric of space-time. The long-range sensors showed a blinding flash of gamma radiation from the Haven system's coordinates, a flare so intense it momentarily overwhelmed the quantum-entangled comms network. Then, nothing. Just the cold, indifferent hiss of the cosmic background. For 72 hours, Earth held its breath. The official channels spoke of stellar phenomena, of unforeseen navigational hazards. Alara knew better. The flash was too precise, its energy signature too clean for any natural event. It was the signature of a weapon, one of monstrous scale. On the 3rd day, the message arrived. It was broadcast on all public frequencies, an open transmission from the Vex hegemony, a crystalline, non-organic race that had observed humanity's slow crawl into the galaxy with a detached, geological patience. Their ships, faceted obsidian monoliths that moved without propulsion, had been sighted on the galactic fringes, but they had never initiated contact. Their message was not a declaration of war or a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a synthesized, dispassionate voice that chimed with 1,000 harmonic undertones. The vessel designated Odyssey, of Sol origin, has breached a legally mandated quarantine zone in the Trappist G7 system, the voice intoned, as per Interdict 47 of the Galactic Compact, to prevent the spread of aggressive, rapidly reproducing biological contaminants. The vessel and its entire payload have been sanitized. The system is now sterile. This matter is concluded. Appended to the message was a 10-second video clip. It showed the Odyssey, beautiful and serene against the backdrop of a swirling nebula, suddenly engulfed in a lance of pure white light. The ship didn't explode. It sublimated, peeling apart at a molecular level until it was nothing but a brief, incandescent ghost. The collective scream of humanity was silent but deafening. 100,000 lives, the entire backup of Earth's biosphere, the works of Shakespeare and the music of Bosch, the very blueprint of their future, all dismissed as a biological contaminant. The quarantine zone, the interdict, the Galactic Compact humanity had never heard of them. They were laws made by an unseen council that had never bothered to speak to the species it had just condemned. Alara Vance, now the most famous widow in the solar system, became the face of that grief. In her first public address, her face was pale and drawn, but her voice was a sliver of ice. She didn't weep. She spoke of the people on board, of the library of seeds in the cryovaults, of the children who would never wake to see their new home. She spoke of her husband. Her raw, controlled agony resonated across the planets in orbital habitats, a quiet requiem for a future that had been stolen. The Vex's justification was more than an insult. It was an act of profound contempt, the swatting of a fly by a being that couldn't even be bothered to learn its name. But it was the leak that turned humanity's grief into a single, cold shard of rage. It came from a rogue listening post of the Cygnian Ascendancy, a rival power to the Vex, slipped anonymously into Earth's data networks. It was the full, unedited recording of the Odyssey's final moments. The footage was 47 minutes long. It showed the Vex fleet, 3 obsidian monoliths, emerging from subspace. It showed Captain Evan Vance opening a channel, his voice calm and professional, broadcasting the standard United Earth greeting protocol in over 1,000 languages, including complex mathematical proofs of peaceful intent. "This is Captain Evan Vance of the Earth Ark Odyssey," he said, his warm, familiar voice echoing in a tomb of a control room. "We come in peace for all mankind." The Vex did not respond. Their internal communications, translated by the Cygnian AI, were chilling. There was no anger, no fear, no malice. There was only a cold, alien logic. "Organic expansion is exponential," one Vex transmission stated, the sound like falling glass. "Their biology is a chaotic algorithm. Pruning is the only logical recourse to maintain systemic harmony." Another replied, "Concur. The potential for infestation outweighs the value of the data sample." They debated the most efficient method of sanitization, settling on a focused graviton beam to ensure no biological matter could survive. The footage showed them firing as Evan was mid-sentence, his image on their view screen dissolving into static an instant before his ship ceased to exist. They had listened to his greeting, understood his peaceful intent, and murdered him and everyone he carried without a second thought, not as an act of war, but as an act of galactic pest control. That was the moment the old humanity died, the one that preached tolerance, the one that sought acceptance among the stars, the one that believed in reason and diplomacy. It died, and something much older awoke in its place. At the emergency summit in Geneva, the calls for sanctions and strongly worded condemnations were drowned out by a tide of silent, unblinking fury. The president of the Unified Earth Protectorate, her face grim, spoke a single phrase that had not been uttered in over a century, invoking a protocol so secret that most of the military high command didn't know it existed. Authorized Goliath. Far out in the Kuiper Belt, in a hollowed-out asteroid designated Tartarus, retired Admiral Aris Thorne was pulled from his quiet life of tending hydroponic gardens and reading ancient history. He was a relic, a ghost of the brutal consolidation wars, a man who had designed humanity's most terrible weapons in the secret hope they would never be used. He was escorted through kilometers of silent, pressurized tunnels to a command deck that had lain dormant for decades. The air still smelled of ozone and recycled steel. He placed his palm on a cold scanner, and the room bloomed into life around him. Holographic displays flickered on, showing the outlines of 24 colossal warships hidden in deep space anchorages across the Sol system. They were the Goliath fleet. They were not sleek cruisers or nimble destroyers. They were behemoths, each the size of a small city, built around a single terrifying weapon, the World Breaker, a graviton lance capable of inducing a resonance cascade in a planet's core, cracking it open like an egg. They were ships designed not to win wars, but to end civilizations. Thorn, his face a mask of stone, watched their status lights shift from deep red to amber. The ghosts were waking up. His terminal chimed, alerting him to a single, Priority 1 encrypted message, routed directly to his personal comm. It was from Dr. Ilara Vance. It contained no words, only a file, the full manifest of every man, woman, and child aboard the Odyssey. 100,000 names. Eris Thorn stared at the list, the weight of every soul settling onto his shoulders. He turned to the comms officer, his voice the low growl of a coming earthquake. "Wake them all up," he commanded. "Spool up the lances, and plot a course for the Vex homeworld." The awakening of the Goliath fleet was not a triumphant roar, but a deep, tectonic groan that resonated through the bones of the Sol system. From the silent darkness of their anchorages in the Oort cloud, 24 mountains of metal began to stir. Power conduits, thick as ancient redwoods, glowed with the cold, blue-white fire of newly ignited fusion cores. Cryo-slumbering crews, men and women who were themselves relics of a harder age, were revived in a cascade of automated protocols. These were not the bright-eyed explorers of the Odyssey. They were the quiet professionals of the Consolidation Wars, the Siege of Ganymede, and the Proxima incursions. They were soldiers who had been deemed too brutal, too uncompromising for an era of peace, and had been put on ice along with their weapons. A promise and a threat in equal measure. Now, their promise had been broken by an outside force, and their threat was being unleashed upon the galaxy. Admiral Eris Thorn stood on the command deck of the flagship Terminus, a vessel so vast its internal gravity was a full 1.1 G. He watched the fleet assemble on the holographic command table, 24 points of light converging into a single, brutal spearhead. Each ship was a testament to a paranoid, fearful humanity, a species that had learned from its own history that the only true guarantee of peace was the capacity for absolute, unanswerable violence. The crews moved with a silent efficiency, their faces etched with the same cold resolve Thorn felt settling in his own heart. There were no cheers, no patriotic slogans. There was only the quiet hum of machinery and the shared, unspoken understanding of their purpose. They were not a fleet of exploration or defense. They were an instrument of retribution, a scalpel forged to carve a name into the heart of an empire that did not know theirs. Dr. Ilara Vance arrived on the terminus via a sealed military shuttle 2 days before the fleet was scheduled to break orbit. Thorn had protested her presence, arguing that the flagship of a vengeance fleet was no place for a civilian, no matter how symbolic. He met her in the docking bay, a cavernous space filled with the scent of ionized air and lubricants, intending to send her back to Earth with his regrets. But the woman who stepped off the shuttle was not the grieving widow from the public broadcasts. The grief was still there, a hollowed-out space behind her eyes, but it had been filled with something hard and unyielding. She carried a single data slate. "Admiral," she said, her voice steady, devoid of any tremor. "You have the names of the dead. I have their lives." She held out the slate. "This is the complete backup of the Odyssey's cultural and personal archives. Every message home, every log entry, every piece of art, every childhood memory recorded by a parent. It's all there." Thorn looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And what do you expect me to do with this?" Doctor read it to the Vex before we opened fire. She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. No, I expect you to give it to your crews. This cannot be a war for an abstract principle. Admiral, vengeance is a hollow thing. It burns out. But memory is a fuel that lasts forever. I want every person in this fleet to know exactly who they are fighting for, not for humanity, but for Yvonne Vance, who loved bad jokes, for Lena Petrova, the 6-year-old who wanted to be the first to map the rivers on Haven, for the 100,000 souls the Vex dismissed as a data sample. I am here to make sure you are not just an army. I am here to make sure you are an answer. Thorn, a man who had studied the fall of empires and the psychology of total war, recognized the terrifying wisdom in her words. An army driven by hate could be broken. An army driven by memory, by love, by a specific and personal loss multiplied 100,000 times, was unbreakable. He acquiesced. Alara was given a small lab adjoining the primary data core of the Terminus, and from there, she began her work. She didn't just distribute the files, she wove them into the very fabric of the fleet. The names of the Odyssey's dead scrolled silently on secondary monitors on every bridge. Before each shift, a ship's AI would read a randomly selected personal log entry over the internal comms. Soldiers on the firing range found their targets replaced by holographic representations of Vex ships, with the faces of smiling children from the Odyssey superimposed over them for a single, gut-wrenching second before they fired. The mess halls played the music composed on the Ark. The war became intimate. The enemy's crime was no longer a distant act of cosmic arrogance. It was the murder of people they were coming to know, to love, to mourn. They were no longer just the Goliath fleet. They were the ghosts of the Odyssey, and they were going hunting. As they prepared for the final jump to the Galactic fringe, Thorn found himself standing beside Alara in the ship's stellar observatory. A vast, transparent dome revealed the Milky Way in all its silent, terrible beauty. They won't understand what's coming for them, Alara said softly, her eyes on a distant star cluster where the Vex hegemony held sway. The Signian data shows they have no concept of grief or rage. To them, emotion is just a processing error, a flaw in biological code. Thorn nodded, his hands clasped behind his back. They believe logic is the ultimate weapon. They think mathematics and probability are the only universal truths. He turned his gaze from the stars to her. We're going to teach them a new one, the equation of pain. The fleet's transition into subspace was a violent tearing of reality. The journey to Vex territory was 3 weeks in the compressed, non-linear hell of hyperspace. When they emerged, it was into a silence more profound than any they had known. They were in the Seraphina Nebula, a graveyard of ancient stars, its swirling clouds of incandescent gas hiding them from conventional sensors. Their target was a Vex Clarion, a deep space communications and sensor node that served as the primary watchdog for this sector. According to the Signian intelligence, it was a crystalline latticework 50 kilometers wide, defended by a squadron of autonomous Shepherd drones. It was here they would deliver their first message. The fleet approached under complete emission control, propelled by graviton drives that bent space around them, leaving no heat or energy trail. They were a flotilla of ghosts gliding through the cosmic dust. On the bridge of the Terminus, the tension was a physical presence. They were less than 1 million kilometers out when the Clarion hailed them. There was no sound, only a pure data stream, a complex mathematical query projected directly into their systems. It wasn't a warning. It was a question. The Vex node was trying to categorize them and to fit their impossible size and energy signatures into its logical framework. It was trying to understand. It sees us as an anomaly. The tactical officer reported, his voice tight. It's requesting our purpose. Thorn stared at the main view screen, which showed a computer-generated image of the vast, glowing Vex construct. It was beautiful, intricate, and utterly alien. He thought of even Vance, broadcasting his peaceful intentions to a creature that was debating the most efficient way to murder him. He looked at Ilara, who stood beside his command chair, her face a pale, determined mask. Her eyes were locked on the screen. "Dr. Vance," Thorn said, his voice low but carrying across the silent bridge. "You said you were here to make sure we were an answer. The Vex are asking a question. Would you care to reply?" Ilara stepped forward and keyed her comm to the fleet-wide channel. Her voice, clear and cold, filled every corridor and every cockpit of the 24 warships. She didn't speak to the Vex. She spoke to the fleet. "This is for the crew of the Odyssey, for the 100,000 voices they silenced." She took a breath. "Give them their echo." Aboard every ship in the Goliath fleet, a single synchronized command was executed. From the armored heart of each vessel, the primary weapon systems came online. Hatches slid open, revealing the maws of the World-Breaker lances, their focusing emitters glowing with the light of trapped singularities. "On my mark," Thorn commanded, his eyes never leaving the Clarion. "Fire as one." The Vex node continued its broadcast, its query becoming more insistent, unable to process the illogical escalation. It was a mind of pure reason confronting the abyss of pure, focused hatred. "Mark," Thorn said. 24 lances of pure, weaponized gravity, invisible and instantaneous, tore across the void. They did not strike the Clarion, they struck the space it occupied. For a fraction of a second, the crystalline station was subjected to the gravitational forces of a black hole. It did not explode. It imploded, shattering into a cloud of glittering dust that was then crushed into nothingness. The Shepherd drones, their control node gone, simply went inert, tumbling aimlessly in the dark. The entire engagement lasted less than a second. Where the Vex's grand station had been, there was now only the nebula, undisturbed. There was no debris, no radiation, no sign that anything had ever been there at all. The erasure was complete. On the bridge of the terminus, the tactical officer turned from his console, his eyes wide. "Admiral, subspace comms are lighting up across the sector. The Vex. They're screaming." Thorn allowed himself the barest hint of a grim smile. "Good," he said. "Let them scream. We're just getting started." The Vex did not scream with sound. They screamed with data. A torrent of pure, frantic logic flooded the subspace channels, a cascade of mathematical proofs of disbelief and outrage. The destruction of the Clarion was not just an attack, it was a violation of physics, an act of such impossible, targeted violence that it broke their predictive models. To the Vex, the universe was a complex but ultimately solvable equation. The Goliath fleet was a variable they hadn't accounted for, a brutal, irrational number that had just been scrawled across their perfect calculations. From the Signian intelligence, Thorn and his command staff learned that the Vex hegemony was not a traditional empire with planets and cities, but a decentralized, networked consciousness inhabiting crystalline macrostructures scattered across a dozen star systems. They didn't have a homeworld. They had nodes, nexus points of processing power and energy production. The Clarion had been a minor one. Their next target was not. It was designated Primary Chorus, a nexus located in a trinary star system, a structure so vast it orbited all three suns in a complex, hypnotic dance. Chorus was a Vex archive, a library of cosmic history stretching back millions of years. Destroying it would be the equivalent of burning the Library of Alexandria. But for a species that valued data above all else, it would be an act of sacrilege, a wound from which their collective psyche might never recover. The journey to Chorus was a tense, silent affair. The fleet moved in a dispersed formation, using the gravitational shadows of rogue planets and asteroid fields as cover. They knew the Vex were now hunting them, their Shepherd drones sweeping the nebula in precise, overlapping patterns. But the Goliath ships were designed for this kind of war. Their hulls were coated in a metamaterial that absorbed sensor pings. Their heat signatures were vented into pocket dimensions, and their graviton drives left no wake. They were shadows moving through a realm of shadows. On board the Terminus, Elara Vance's work had evolved. She was no longer just a keeper of memory. She had become the fleet's conscience and its fury. She had isolated the Vex's internal communications from the Clarion engagement, and with the help of the ship's AI, had begun to decipher their language of pure mathematics. She discovered something that chilled her to the bone. The Vex did not have a word for mercy, but they did have a precise mathematical concept for acceptable loss. They had calculated the destruction of the Odyssey as an acceptable loss to preserve the harmony of their designated territory. She broadcast her findings to the fleet, along with a simple appended message of her own. They have a term for acceptable loss. It is our duty to teach them the meaning of unacceptable. The crews responded with a grim, renewed determination. The war was no longer just about vengeance for the dead. It was a crusade against the very philosophy that had deemed them expendable. It was a war against a sterile cosmic calculus, waged by the messy and passionate and infinitely dangerous arithmetic of the human heart. When they arrived at the Chorus system, the scale of the Vex structure was breathtaking. It was a web of crystalline filaments and geometric nodes that pulsed with the captured light of the three stars. A city of glass and logic that sang a silent, mathematical song to the cosmos. It was defended by a fleet of Vex wardens, larger, more powerful versions of the Shepherd drones, their obsidian hulls bristling with energy projectors. The Goliath fleet emerged from subspace at the system's edge, a silent, brutalist counterpoint to the Vex's ethereal architecture. There was no attempt at stealth this time. Their arrival was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge issued. The wardens moved to intercept them immediately, their formations perfect, their movements governed by flawless combat algorithms. "They're trying to communicate," the comms officer reported. "It's a demand for our surrender. They are offering us integration, a chance to be uploaded into their consciousness, to be preserved as a data point." Admiral Thorn listened, his face impassive. He looked over at Elara. She was staring at the image of Chorus, at the impossibly beautiful structure that represented an entire civilization's soul. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes. The ghost of the humanity that had sent poets and artists into the void. And then he saw it harden into something else. She met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. "Open a channel," Thorn commanded. "Fleet-wide. Audio only." A moment later, his voice boomed across the command decks of 24 warships. "The Vex offer to preserve us as data. They wish to remember us." He paused, letting the bitter irony sink in. Let's give them something to remember. The battle began not with a salvo of weapons, but with an act of pure, psychological warfare devised by Ilara. "Broadcast the archive," Thorn ordered. The Terminus unleashed the full cultural and personal archive of the Odyssey as a raw, chaotic data stream aimed directly at the Vex network. It was not encrypted or translated. It was a digital scream. The sound of a baby's laughter, the image of a husband kissing his wife goodbye, the frantic, final heartbeats from the medical logs, the soaring notes of a symphony, the jumbled, terrified thoughts of 100,000 dying minds. All of it was hurled into the Vex's pristine, logical consciousness. To the hyper-rational Vex, it was the equivalent of a billion contradictory, nonsensical axioms being injected into a perfect proof. Their network shuddered. The Warden fleet, for a single, critical second, faltered. Their perfect formations wavered as their central consciousness struggled to process the onslaught of pure, unfiltered, illogical emotion. It was the opening the Goliath fleet needed. "Fire at will," Thorn commanded, his voice as cold as the void. "Break them." The human fleet did not engage in elegant maneuvers. They advanced in a solid, unyielding line, a wall of armor and guns. Their secondary batteries, massive railgun turrets and plasma cannons, opened up, filling the space between the fleets with a storm of incandescent fury. The World-Breaker lances remained silent, held in reserve for the main target. The Vex Wardens, recovering from the initial shock, returned fire with beams of coherent light that sliced through the dark. The battle was a clash of philosophies. The Vex fought with precision and efficiency, targeting weak points, exploiting angles, their every move calculated for maximum effect. The humans fought with brute force and controlled rage. Their ship captains didn't wait for optimal firing solutions. They identified a target and saturated it with overwhelming firepower until it ceased to exist. The Terminus itself became the anchor of the human line. Warden beams, each capable of gutting a lesser ship, splashed against its meter-thick adamantium hull, the impacts sounding like the tolling of a great iron bell. Thorn stood on the bridge, a stoic statue amidst the controlled chaos, his orders concise and brutal. "Target their command, Warden. Overload its core. I want it to detonate." The human ships focused their fire, and the lead Vex vessel, a Warden larger than the others, was caught in a converging storm of plasma and kinetic slugs. It shattered, its demise sending a feedback loop of corrupted logic through the Vex battle network. For the first time, the Vex fleet showed signs of disarray. It was during this momentary lull that Ilara made another discovery. Buried deep within the data stream from the Vex network was a repeating signal, a sub-frequency that was not part of their standard communication. It was a distress call. "Admiral," she said, her voice urgent. "There's something else here." Inside chorus. "It's biological. It's not Vex." Thorn glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "A prisoner?" "I don't know," she replied, her fingers flying across her console. The signal is heavily suppressed, but it's old, very old, and it's repeating a pattern, a plea. But there was no time to investigate. The Warden fleet, ceding the battle in space, was falling back, forming a defensive shield around the primary chorus structure itself. They were preparing for the final, desperate defense of their most sacred place. They're sacrificing their fleet to protect the archive, the tactical officer observed, a note of disbelief in his voice. All units, cease fire, Thorn commanded. The human guns fell silent. The space before them was littered with the crystalline wreckage of Vex Wardens, glittering like shattered diamonds in the light of the three suns. The remaining Vex ships were now little more than a translucent barrier between the Goliath fleet and their prize. Thorn turned to Alara. A biological signal, a plea. He looked back at the main screen, at the majestic, silent chorus. He thought of the 100,000 souls they had come to avenge. He thought of the Vex's cold, dismissive logic. He had come here to burn their history, to inflict a wound as deep as his own species had suffered. But the universe was rarely so simple. A prisoner, a plea. Get me a lock on that signal, he said to Alara, his voice grim. Tell the fleet to hold their positions. Prepare a single boarding craft. The tactical officer stared at him, aghast. Admiral, our orders. Thorn cut him off with a glare that could have melted steel. Our orders were to deliver an answer. I'm beginning to think we don't yet fully understand the question. He looked at Chorus, a monument to a civilization he had sworn to destroy, and for the first time since leaving Earth, he felt a sliver of something other than rage uncertainty. The equation of pain had suddenly become much more complex. The boarding craft, the stiletto, was a sliver of matte black metal, a ghost designed to slip through the seams of a war zone. It detached from the underbelly of the terminus and accelerated towards the wounded heart of the Vex fleet, a lone shark gliding through a field of dying leviathans. On board were Admiral Thorn, Dr. Alara Vance, and a 10-person team of heavily armed Void Marines, their powered armor sealed and silent. Thorn's decision had sent a ripple of confusion through the fleet, but his command was absolute. The World-Breaker lances remained charged, a silent promise hanging over the chorus system, but for now, the guns were quiet. Alara sat strapped into a seat opposite Thorn, her eyes closed, a neural interface linking her directly to the ship's sensor suite. She was their guide, chasing the faint, ancient whisper of a biological signal through a storm of Vex data. It's like they're hiding it, she murmured, her voice distant. The signal is wrapped in layers of quantum encryption, buried beneath petabytes of historical data. They're not just imprisoning a creature, they're trying to erase the very concept of it from their network. The stiletto weaved through the wreckage, its stealth systems working overtime to mask its approach from the remaining warden ships. The Vex, in their damaged state, seemed focused on protecting the chorus archive, their logic unable to process the illogical shift in human tactics from total annihilation to a surgical insertion. They registered the stiletto as debris, another piece of battlefield detritus. The craft landed without a sound on one of the crystalline filaments connecting two of the larger nodes of Chorus. The view from the main portal was surreal. They were standing on a structure of pure, translucent crystal, through which flowed rivers of light, the physical data of the Vex consciousness. Outside, the silent vacuum was filled with the triple glare of the system's suns, refracting through the latticework in a billion dazzling colors. We're here, The pilot's voice crackled over the internal comm. The Void Marines disembarked first, their mag boots locking onto the crystalline surface as they formed a defensive perimeter. Thorn and Alara followed, stepping out into the silent, alien beauty of the Vex construct. The biological signal was stronger now, a rhythmic, pulsing thrum that Alara could feel in her bones even without the interface. It was coming from deep within the node before them. The entrance is a frequency-keyed aperture, Alara stated, pointing towards a seemingly solid wall of crystal. It's not a door, it's a phase gate. It will only open if we broadcast the correct mathematical key. She began working on her wrist-mounted data slate, her brow furrowed in concentration. I can't break it. But maybe... She paused. Maybe I don't have to. She looked up at Thorn. The Vex logic is absolute. A key must fit a lock. But human thought isn't so rigid. We can use a key that's close enough to make the lock question its own integrity. She began to input a new command. Not a complex decryption algorithm, but a simple, paradoxical one. The formula for a fractal that never resolved. A piece of infinite, chaotic data. She broadcast it at the gate. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the smooth, crystalline surface before them began to shimmer, the light within it flickering erratically as the gate's logic processor tried and failed to compute the impossible, irrational input. With a sound like cracking ice, a perfect circular opening phased into existence. Inside, the environment was even more alien. They were in a vast, silent chamber, the walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed in time with the faint signal. The air, surprisingly, was breathable, thin and cold, with a metallic tang. At the center of the chamber, floating in a containment field of shimmering energy, was the source of the signal. It was a creature unlike anything they had ever seen, a being of both biological and ethereal matter. It had a vaguely humanoid torso, but its limbs were tendrils of pure light, and its head was a swirling corona of soft, golden energy in which 1,000 tiny stars seemed to swim. It was ancient, weary, and trapped. As they approached, a voice echoed not in their ears, but directly in their minds, a voice of immense age and profound sadness. The Void Marines raised their rifles, but Thorn motioned for them to stand down. "Who are you?" he projected, his own thoughts feeling clumsy and loud in the sudden telepathic silence. The creature's light tendrils shifted. It paused, the golden corona of its head dimming slightly. Alara stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "They imprisoned you. Why?" The Weaver's mental voice was laced with an ancient sorrow. "My song is woven into the fabric of this system, so they built their library around me, using my own energy to power their logic, and using their logic to suppress my voice. They have been holding me here for eons, studying me, trying to solve the problem of my existence. They are not conquerors, child of Earth. They are librarians. And they have decided your chaotic, emotional song is a book that does not belong in their collection." Thorn felt a cold dread creep up his spine. The Vex weren't just murderers, they were cosmic censors, pruning reality of anything that didn't conform to their rigid, sterile logic. The destruction of the Odyssey hadn't been an act of pest control. It had been an act of editorial curation. The Weaver continued. It focused its strange, stellar gaze on Thorn, an act of vengeance, a response in a language they're only just beginning to learn, but you would be destroying their history, their knowledge, and me along with it. What is the alternative? Thorn asked, his voice raw. The weaver's tendrils of light reached out, not touching them, but projecting a vision into their minds. They saw the Vex as they once were, a simple crystalline life form on a lone, dark planet, slowly evolving a consciousness based on the pure, cold beauty of mathematics. They saw them reach for the stars, not with ambition, but with a desire to understand, to categorize, to bring order to a chaotic universe. And they saw the moment of their fall, the decision that anything they could not understand was a flaw that must be corrected, erased, sanitized. The Weaver's voice whispered in their minds, "You can burn their library and leave them with nothing but the ash of their certainty. Or you can give them a new equation to solve." The Weaver pulsed with a soft, golden light. Thorn looked at Alara. Her face was a mixture of awe, horror, and a dawning, terrible understanding. The choice before them was no longer simple vengeance. It was a choice that would define not just the future of the Vex, but the future of humanity. They could be destroyers, leaving a monument of fear in their wake. Or they could be something else, something far more difficult and far more dangerous. They could be teachers. "How do we free you?" Thorn asked, his decision made. The Weaver's form brightened. It turned its gaze to Ilara. "What concept?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The Weaver's mental voice filled their minds, powerful and clear. The concept of forgiveness, when translated into the pure mathematics of the Vex, was a logical impossibility. It was a variable that negated its own premise, an act of accepting a flawed outcome without correction. To the Vex, it was the ultimate processing error, a philosophical black hole, standing in the heart of their most sacred archive. Ilara Vance closed her eyes, not to remember the pain of her husband's death, but to truly understand it. She reached out with her mind, through the neural interface, and touched the core of the Terminus's broadcasting system. But this time, she didn't send a scream of rage. She sent a story. She broadcast the full, unedited memory of her life with even their first meeting, their wedding, the quiet moments of domestic peace, the tearful farewell before he boarded the Odyssey, and the agonizing, silent hours she spent waiting for a signal that would never come. She wrapped all of it, the love, the joy, the hope, the gut-wrenching loss, in a single, impossible command to the Vex consciousness: "We forgive you." It was an act of profound, almost insane, psychological warfare. The Vex network, already reeling from the illogical data of grief, was hit by a paradox it could not resolve. To forgive, one must first acknowledge a wrong. To acknowledge a wrong was to admit a flaw in their logic. To admit a flaw was to invalidate the very foundation of their existence. Across the chorus structure, the rivers of light flickered and died. The crystalline walls trembled, not from a physical impact, but from the sheer cognitive dissonance of the act. The containment field around the Weaver wavered, its perfect geometry collapsing under the strain of the paradox, with a final, silent chime that resonated through their minds. The energy field dissolved. The Weaver was free. A wave of pure, unrestrained life force erupted from its form, a song of such complex, emotional beauty that the humans on the platform fell to their knees. It was a song of creation and decay, of joy and sorrow, of a universe teeming with infinite, chaotic, wonderful possibilities. The song washed over the chorus archive, not destroying it, but illuminating it. The stored data, the millions of years of sterile, logical observation, was suddenly infused with context, with meaning, with the messy, beautiful imperfection of life. The remaining Vex wardenships, which had been holding their defensive positions, simply stopped. Their energy weapons powered down. Their perfect formations broke, and they began to drift, their inner consciousness overwhelmed by the sudden, radical expansion of their reality. They were no longer just librarians, they were listeners. The Weaver's golden light filled the chamber, and its voice echoed in their minds one last time. And with that, the ancient being dissolved into a cascade of golden motes that flowed out of the chamber and into the heart of the Vex network, its song spreading through their consciousness like a seed taking root in barren soil. Thorn helped Alara to her feet. They were both shaking, drained by the sheer psychic intensity of the moment. "It's over," Alara whispered, though she wasn't sure what it was. The battle was won, but the war felt like it had transformed into something else entirely. "No," Thorn said, his voice quiet but firm as he looked at the now sentient, silent Vex ships. "It's just begun." Their return to the terminus was met with a stunned silence. The entire fleet had witnessed the impossible on their screens, the Vex fleet powering down, the chorus archive pulsing with a new, warm light. Thorn broadcast his report, explaining the existence of the Weaver and the choice he had made. The reaction was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a slow, dawning respect. Some captains argued that they had betrayed their mission, that justice for the Odyssey demanded nothing less than the complete annihilation of the Vex. But for many, the sight of the enemy fleet simply stopping, listening, had been more profound than any explosion. The equation of pain had been solved not by force, but by an impossible act of grace. The Goliath fleet did not fire another shot. They remained in the chorus system for 1 week, a silent, armored vigil, as the Vex consciousness underwent a revolutionary transformation. The Cygnian Ascendancy, monitoring from afar, reported that the Vex's frantic data screams had been replaced by a single continuous broadcast of the Weaver's song, a complex, evolving melody that was slowly integrating the chaotic data of the Odyssey archive into its harmony. The Vex were learning. They were grieving. In their own alien way, they were repenting. When the Goliath fleet finally turned for home, they left behind a Vex hegemony that was irrevocably changed and a silent, open channel of communication. Their final transmission to the Vex was not a threat, but a simple image, a star chart of the Sol system, a clear and unambiguous invitation to talk. The journey back was subdued. The fire of vengeance had been replaced by the heavy, complicated weight of peacemaking. They had gone out as destroyers and were returning as something else, something they didn't have a name for yet. Arriving back in the Sol system, they were met not as conquering heroes, but as a silent, somber question mark. The news of their actions had preceded them, dividing humanity. Many hailed them as saviors who had stared into the abyss and chosen a better path. Others condemned them as traitors who had spared the murderers of 100,000 people. Admiral Eris Thorn and Dr. Elara Vance found themselves at the center of this storm. In his final address before the Unified Earth Protectorate Summit, Thorn, in his full dress uniform, did not speak of tactics or victory. He spoke of the Weaver, of a universe more complex than humanity had ever imagined. We were sent to deliver an answer, he concluded, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. But we learned that the purpose of a voice is not merely to answer an echo, but to start a conversation. The Vex made a mistake born of ignorance and fear. We almost made a mistake born of pain and rage. We chose to break that cycle. The future of that choice is now in your hands. The Goliath fleet was decommissioned. Its great ships once again put into silent anchorages in the cold dark. Their purpose served. Admiral Thorne retired for a second and final time, returning to his asteroid garden, a quiet man who had held the fate of 2 civilizations in his hands and had chosen the harder path. Ilara Vance, however, found a new purpose. She became Earth's foremost ambassador for interspecies communication, dedicating her life to understanding the new Vex and the countless other non-human intelligences that they now knew were watching from the silence. Years later, a single, faceted obsidian monolith, a Vex emissary, entered the Sol system. It did not carry weapons. It did not broadcast demands. It stopped at the edge of the system and transmitted a single, complex melody, the Weaver's Song, now interwoven with a new, contrapuntal theme of profound, mathematical sorrow. It was an apology, an elegy, and a question, all in one. It was their first word in a conversation that would last for 1,000 years. On Earth. At the memorial built for the crew of the Odyssey, HFY, reflecting pool that mirrored the stars, Ilara Vance listened to the transmission, the alien music bringing tears to her eyes. The pain of her loss had never truly faded, but it was no longer a fire that demanded vengeance. It was a memory, a foundation upon which a new, stranger, and more hopeful future was being built. She had not gotten her husband back, but she had honored his mission. He had gone out to say hello to the universe. In the end, after a long and terrible journey through the dark, the universe was finally beginning to say hello back.